Picture this. Thousands of years ago, a small group of humans gathers around a fire. Someone throws a bundle of dried plants onto the hot coals. Maybe they're trying to stay warm. Maybe they're performing a ceremony. Or maybe somebody just collected terrible firewood. The shelter begins filling with thick, unfamiliar smoke. A few minutes later, everyone gets quiet. One person becomes deeply fascinated by the flames. Another suddenly realizes they haven't eaten in what feels like several winters. And somewhere in the corner, one very confused ancestor is trying to remember whether shadows have always moved like that. Could this have been humanity's first cannabis high? Sure. Can we prove it? Not even close. And that's where this story gets complicated. Because cannabis doesn't survive underground with a tiny note attached to it saying, yes, we smoked this. Ancient seeds might have been food. Stalks might have been turned into rope. Leaves could have been used as medicine. And a plant placed inside a grave might have been sacred, practical, decorative, or just incredibly lucky at not decomposing. So the real mystery isn't simply when humans found cannabis. It's when they figured out what it could do to the mind. And our best clue doesn't come from a famous king, an ancient pharmacy, or some legendary inventor. It comes from burned wooden containers found inside tombs, nearly 2 miles above sea level. But before we get there, we need to meet cannabis before it became cannabis. Before the names, the strains, and the suspiciously expensive snacks, back when it was just another plant growing near people. Cannabis has deep roots in Asia, although identifying its exact original home is difficult. Humans have carried it around for thousands of years. They planted it, crossed different populations, abandoned fields, and allowed cultivated plants to escape back into the wild. That creates a problem. A cannabis plant growing by itself might look completely wild, even if its ancestors spent centuries being carefully raised by farmers. It's basically a plant with a complicated family history. Cannabis also grows well in disturbed ground. It likes places altered by animals and humans, pathways, riverbanks, campsites, settlement edges, and piles of discarded material. So early humans probably didn't discover it in some hidden valley guarded by wolves. It may have appeared right beside the place where everyone dumped their trash. And once people noticed it, the plant offered several useful features. Its seeds contained nutrients. Its stems held long, strong fibers. Its flowers produced a powerful smell. And some varieties contained enough psychoactive chemicals to change perception. But that last feature wasn't guaranteed. Wild cannabis wasn't necessarily as potent as many modern varieties. One plant might produce a noticeable effect. Another might do almost nothing. Finding the plant was easy. Finding the right plant was another matter. The chemical mainly responsible for cannabis intoxication is THC. But fresh cannabis doesn't begin with large amounts of active THC. Much of it exists as THCA, a related compound that isn't strongly intoxicating in the same way. Heat changes that. When cannabis is heated, THCA can be converted into THC through a process known as decarboxylation. Ancient people didn't need to understand that word. They didn't require a laboratory or a chemistry degree. They only needed to notice a pattern. This plant smells strange when heated. That sticky flower does more than the dry stalk. And for some reason, Kevin has been staring at the moon since dinner. Still, accidentally throwing cannabis into a campfire might not have produced a dramatic experience. An outdoor fire lets smoke escape. Intense flames can destroy active compounds. And if the plant contains very little THC, burning a few stalks probably won't do much beyond annoying everyone's eyes. A noticeable effect would require several things to happen together. The cannabis needed to be potent enough. The resin-rich parts had to be heated without immediately turning to ash. Enough smoke had to collect. And people needed to inhale it inside an enclosed or partly enclosed area. That's a very specific accident. Humans may have lived around cannabis for generations before someone finally discovered the correct combination.
A useful plant can hide more than one secret. Cannabis may have first become important for a much less exciting reason: rope.
The outer part of its stalk contains long fibers. If those stalks are soaked or allowed to partially break down, the softer plant material begins separating from the stronger fibers. That process is called retting.
The fibers can then be cleaned, twisted, and turned into cord, nets, fabric, baskets, and rope. That might not sound as dramatic as an ancient, smoke-filled ceremony, but rope was enormously valuable.
Rope could help people hunt, fish, carry supplies, build shelters, secure animals, and tie things together after somebody insisted knots were unnecessary. Unfortunately, ancient plant fiber doesn't preserve well. It burns, it rots, it disappears.
Archaeologists occasionally find pieces of old textiles or cord impressions pressed into pottery. But even then, identifying the exact plant can be difficult. Several plants produce similar-looking fibers.
Cannabis seeds preserve more easily, especially when they've been charred.
But a seed creates a different problem. People may have eaten it, pressed it for oil, planted it, fed it to animals, or gathered it from a wild plant. The seed remains. The explanation usually doesn't. Genetic research suggests humans may have started domesticating cannabis thousands of years before the earliest secure evidence of smoking it. But genetic estimates must be interpreted carefully.
DNA can help researchers estimate when plant populations began separating from one another. It can't tell us why a particular farmer saved a particular seed.
Early farmers may have selected cannabis for stronger fibers. Others may have preferred plants that produced larger or more numerous seeds. Neither goal required a strong psychoactive effect.
In fact, a plant grown for fiber can look very different from one grown for resinous flowers.
Fiber plants are commonly grown close together. Competition pushes them upward, producing tall stalks with fewer branches.
Plants raised for their flowers are usually given more room. That allows them to branch out and produce more flowering material.
Same species, different human priorities. Cannabis also often produces separate male and female plants. Female flowers develop resin-rich structures called glandular trichomes. If the female plant isn't pollinated, it continues putting energy into flowers and resin rather than making seeds.
At some point, people almost certainly noticed these differences. Some plants were taller,
some smelled stronger,
some had sticky flowers,
and some made a completely ordinary evening feel much longer than expected.
If people valued that effect, they could save seeds from the strongest plants. Over many generations, intentional selection would increase the qualities they wanted.
Humans weren't simply discovering cannabis anymore. They were benzophytes.
One popular story claims medical cannabis was documented in China around 2700 BCE by a legendary ruler named Shennong. Shennong is often described as a divine farmer who tested plants and taught people about medicine.
It's a great story. It's also not a medical record written in 2700 BCE.
Texts connected with Shennong were compiled much later, although some traditions inside them could be older.
That doesn't mean cannabis was unknown in early China. Hemp became an important source of history and food, and later, medical traditions discounts different context of the plant. The problem is language.
An ancient word translated as hemp doesn't automatically mean high THC cannabis. A text might be discussing seeds, fibers, medicine, or a weak plant with little intoxicating effect.
Written history rarely couples the first doubts of something.
By the time a scholar finally writes it down, ordinary people may have been experimenting with it for centuries. The paperwork arrives late. Then, it acts like it was there the whole time. One of the most remarkable discoveries came from the Yanghai tombs near Turpan in what is now northwestern China. Inside a roughly 2,700-year-old grave, archaeologists found a leather container and a wooden bowl holding an unusually large amount of preserved cannabis. Not one seed, not a few random leaves, nearly 2 pounds of plant material. The dry environment preserved parts of the cannabis remarkably well. Researchers found leaves, fruits, shoots, and flowering material. More importantly, much of the less useful material had apparently been removed. Large stems were missing. Male plant parts were largely absent. Resin-producing areas remained. That suggests somebody deliberately prepared and selected the plant. Testing also indicated it had once contained compounds associated with psychoactive cannabis, although thousands of years of decay had altered the original chemistry. The person buried there had other meaningful objects, including weapons, musical instruments, and writing-related equipment. Researchers have suggested he may have held a special social or ritual role. So, was this cannabis meant to get him high? Possibly. But the grave doesn't tell us how it was used. There was no obvious pipe. The plant could have been burned, eaten, mixed into medicine, or carried as ritual material. Yanghai gives us strong evidence that people deliberately collected potent cannabis. But it doesn't quite give us the smoke. For that, we need to climb higher. Around 500 BCE, people were burying their dead at Jirzankal Cemetery in the Pamir Mountains of western China. The cemetery sits around 10,000 feet above sea level. Inside several tombs, archaeologists discovered small wooden braziers with blackened interiors. Some also contained stones that had been exposed to intense heat. Researchers analyzed chemical traces trapped in the burned wood and stones. They detected cannabinol, or CBN. CBN can form when THC breaks down through age and oxidation. In this context, the chemical residue indicated that cannabis containing relatively high levels of psychoactive compounds had been burned inside the braziers.